Hey, Alexis, great to talk to you.
Great meeting you, Joe.
Hey, I appreciate you carving out some time for me. And also, our audience, I know, has been very interested in Greenly. Give us the big picture. When exactly was Greenly founded, and what is your business focus overall?
Sure. So with my co-founders, we started Greenly summer 2019. I was previously based in Boston, working in digital health. Our company had been acquired at Nokia. I actually came back to France, where I'm originally from, followed my wife, and we said, let's do the Fitbit of carbon accounting. Okay. So that was 4 years ago. And essentially, we launched an app that syncs to your bank accounts, kind of like Mint, to compute your credit score, but instead it computes your carbon footprint, right? Your climate score, so to speak. And that was our original traction. We got like up to 100K users, but we realized individuals, were not completely ready to like change their whole lifestyle right away, tracking their footprint, like you would for a Fitbit doing more sports or something. Mm-hmm. So basically, we pivoted once, we pivoted twice, actually. First time was when we started selling an API to banks so that they could include a carbon footprint score within their own user experience. And we've actually got 10 banks as customers, and it's serving about 10 million people. Okay. But nonetheless, we felt, it was hard to get people really changing habits. So we pivoted to companies and essentially SMBs and mid-market, and that was basically a year into the company's foundation. And since we chose to do that, it's been essentially, I wouldn't call it exactly a success story, but let's say a growth story. Mm-hmm. And now we've got about 1,500 companies as customers who we're helping serve, we're serving on their carbon accounting. So that's the short story of Greenly.
Fantastic. So I certainly want to hear more about the SMB, small business and mid-market focus. But before we get there, let's keep it broader just a little bit. Is your early traction mostly with customers and partners outside the United States, or are you seeing some momentum inside the United States? And I asked the question that way just because of, the whole carbon accounting trend. It's different worldwide in terms of where you are regionally.
Yeah. So absolutely. So today we've got about 30% of our business in the US. Okay. So while we were founded in France, the climate change is not a French problem; it's a global problem, right? Mm-hmm. The US is about 25% of global emissions. France is about 1% of global emissions. So if you're really sincere about this problem, you have to think about building a global company. But the thing about starting out in France was interesting is that the regulations are really pushing for this. So and it means that you're already in an ecosystem where you've got a lot of mature SMBs on the topic. And why are they mature about it? It's because they're usually in it's not that they are obliged by law to do it. It's rather that they're in a process where their big customers, their enterprise customers, are saying, look, if you want to work with us, you've got to be part of our own decarbonization plan. And it's already built in the supply chain, the procurement processes. Right. So you've got a lot of SMBs who are essentially thinking, well, if I want to be doing business with a lot of these enterprise customers, I have to have a climate strategy. And so when you're building a startup, and it's much easier to sell to an SMB or a mid-market company than an enterprise. And so that's how we got started, and that's how we got a lot of basically practice serving a lot of companies, building a more and more sophisticated platform serving them. And once we thought, we were ready, basically a year and a half into our pivot on the B2B side, we started expanding to the UK, and then a year ago to the US. The truth is we signed our first $1 million of business 2 weeks ago in the US. We've got about 150 customers, so that gives you an idea of the average basket size. So we're cheap. because there's a huge need as well in the US. What I would say, however, is, obviously the US, is the biggest economy in the world. That's where you have like the most business owners and so on. So even if it's a nascent market, it's still a huge, from a business standpoint, it's still a huge opportunity. And so the trends that we've been seeing in the UK and in Europe are here in the US. It's just probably not as developed. And what I would say is, so most of our customers are not doing this because of a regulation compliance issue. They're doing it, again, for that same reason, because it pays to have a climate strategy when you're working with certain companies. Yep. And so that trend has definitely started in the US. And I'll give you a few examples. We work with a lot of Walmart suppliers. Walmart has this, as part of the Carbon Disclosure Project, supply chain program. And so they've set a target for their indirect emissions linked to their suppliers. And they want to be engaging at least, 8,000 of them, or 60% of their estimated emissions. And so if you want to work with Walmart, you have to do it. And a lot of these companies are small companies, and they're thinking, well, should I go to a consultant? Should I go to a platform? And that's how we begin a conversation with them. The US Army is doing it as well. That's how we signed Fruit of the Loom as a customer, if you've ever worn a white t-shirt. Yep. Et cetera, et cetera. So even before the whole regulation will come into play, there's already this trend that we're seeing growing and growing.
You know what? You just hit on multiple trends that I'm seeing as well, and multiple trends that I want to discuss. And I'll connect the dots between some of those trends you just mentioned and some of the trends I've seen previously that I think are repeating themselves in the market. Walmart's a prime example. When they wanted the world to adopt RFID to track products in their supply chain, they told all their suppliers, you have to get on board with RFID, and the suppliers got on board. Now you're repeating that trend, and you're articulating that same trend happening again with carbon reporting. I agree with you. I believe that is going to happen worldwide.
And sorry to interrupt, but yeah. Amazon is not doing it. On the other hand, they're not tracking. They released their sustainability report today or yesterday. Yes. And what's amazing about it is they're not tracking the emissions linked to whatever products are purchased and sold. So they're basically leaving out 95% of their emissions, as opposed to Walmart.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I agree with you. These trends are very fascinating to watch. Some of the other trends that reinforce what you're sharing. I previously covered the HIPAA trend here in the United States in terms of healthcare privacy, the Sarbanes-Oxley trend in terms of financial services and reporting on financial services. I'm curious, from your vantage point, in Europe, there's a lot of talk about the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, otherwise known as CSRD. Now, as I see it, on the one hand, I think a lot of US companies are becoming familiar with it, but on the other hand, a lot of them think it doesn't apply to them. But I disagree. I think increasingly it will apply to them through the trend you're describing, in terms of big companies telling their small suppliers, I have to comply with CSRD, so you have to adhere to what I'm up to with carbon accounting. I know that was a mouthful, but does that make sense? Is that the trend you're going to see?
So absolutely. I mean, there's several things in what you said. So first of all, CSRD in Europe, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, right, applies to any company that has more than 500 employees in a European state. And so it's estimated that it will apply to about 50,000 companies versus previously like 10,000 for the largest emitters in Europe. And it's also estimated that about 5,000 US companies that have operations in Europe will be subject to that regulation. So the US has the largest amount of global companies in the world. And obviously they're present in Europe. It's usually one of their prime markets outside of the US. So these guys will have to abide. And the thing that I learned recently talking to some of these big corporates is one of the reasons the regulations that have been drafted by the Security Exchange Commission, the SEC, haven't been quite released yet. We were supposed to hear about them in April. Is that the US regulators have realized that these 5,000 or so US companies might have to report the same thing twice under very different formats. And of course, it's a massive headache, right? If you're the ESG function or something. So they're just trying to lift some of that pain away from US companies by aligning, in a sense, to CSRD, because CSRD shot first. So of course the US regulates things however it wants, but if you can minimize the pain for corporations, that helps as well. So so basically, yes, EU regulations are somehow being exported to other countries because of operations, to suppliers. So you've also got a lot of EU corporations that have subsidiaries in the US. So they'll be expected to report like for their global operations and their global supply chains. So they'll be asking US companies to report. So, you know, if you've basically got a big enough hub that's getting interested in its regulation. And one thing you have to think about is when you report emissions, you report your direct emissions, right? That's scope 1. So whatever it is that you're burning directly within your factory with your company-owned cars and what's emitting. You're also reporting your scope 2. So it's the emissions linked to your energy consumption from, say, utilities. There's a power plant somewhere, a coal power plant, and it's burning coal, but it's linked to your energy consumption. That's scope 2. But there's also scope 3, which is, as you know, all the other emissions linked to your supply chain. And CSRD is asking companies to report their most material scope 3 emissions.
Right.
So if you're buying steel from a US corporation, the energy, the emissions linked to the energy spent on steel in the US are not part of your emissions if you're building, let's say, a car in Europe, right? But it is still somehow a dependency of yours in terms of carbon. And so you have to ask your steel maker in the US to do it because it's a material scope 3 emission. So that's how the whole thing spreads, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I want to follow up on a couple of the points you made there. Scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. From your customer base, your early adopters, are you seeing progress across all 3 areas, 1, 2, and 3? Or is scope 3 just so complex that a lot of companies are not tackling that yet?
Okay, no, great question. So actually, I mean, most small companies have a majority of scope 3 and actually pretty minimal scope 1 and 2, because small companies, you know, they're in small offices, so there's a bit of heating that office, and you know, maybe they have a couple companies' cars, but it's not a huge. Scope 2, you know, it's the energy of their electricity. But let's give a precise example. We've in those 1,500 companies that we've helped, we have a lot of tech companies. 98% of the emissions of these companies are in their scope 3.
Okay.
So, and half of that tends to be, say, their consumption of digital products, and half of that tends to be their cloud computing. So basically, the emissions of a unicorn in the UK or in the US is most of its emissions are actually with Amazon Web Services. Right. Because they're crunching a lot of data, and somewhere there's a data center that's consuming a lot of electricity because of all the data they crunch. And that data center is linked to some power plant, which may be, you know, more or less renewable energy. So actually, to your question, where does the progress come from? For a company like that, most of the progress is going to come from reducing their scope 3. And it's actually something you can work on. If I stay on this particular example, if you're this tech company, what do you do about your data centers? Well, there's really two things you can do. You can consume less electricity. And so how do you do that? Well, you choose different instances. You choose, you choose different times of day when you train your AI models, because there's a workload capacity thing. But then if you don't want to change anything with your operations, what you can do is displace your data in a place where the data centers are not linked to coal power, to simplify, but to renewable energy. And that's linked to the energy mix, how carbon intensive is the electricity or where your data center stands. And if it's in Arkansas, it's a lot of coal, but if it's in Quebec or Oregon, it's a lot of hydroelectricity. And that you can basically half the emissions of your data center. So scope 3. But even the large companies, they're buying a ton of stuff. So it's always almost scope 3 that you can have the most impact on.
Got it. Okay, excellent. Thanks for the education. So, you spoke a little bit about these various levels, scope 1, 2, and 3, but also the regulations in Europe and a potential regulation in the US, that SEC regulation that may be coming. You mentioned that we were expecting some chatter back in April of 2023. Fast forward, you and I are talking in July of 2023. The latest buzz says the SEC may say something in October of 2023. Are you hearing anything new, or are your customers asking about this? And do you expect good alignment? You hinted at it before. Do you think they'll align well with the regulations coming out of Europe?
Well, again, I think the explanation of the delay is the alignment, and this was not my idea. I've been told about this by big and small players, right? I thought it was part of the lobby pushing back on the SEC, saying, "Hey, we don't want to report scope 3; it's too hard." And I think there are pretty strong arguments against that, because you can actually estimate your scope 3 pretty quickly with what we call in our expert vocabulary spend-based analytics. You can, which is something we do. You do an integration with your ERP, your enterprise software, or your accounting software, and we scan every single expense. We automatically categorize it. We say, this is cloud, this is steel, this is coffee, this is something else, and then we give you an average carbon intensity per dollar spent, which gives you the ballpark buckets right away. But obviously, and so from a pure reporting standpoint, you can start with something. Now, of course, to be really useful, you have to get more granular, and you have to say it's not how many millions of dollars of steel you purchased, is how many tons of steel, and how much carbon does that ton of steel represent, and who are you buying from. But at least you can get started and then go more granular. But there's a lot of confusion around how difficult it is to be precise around this scope 3. And when you have this notion of emissions being material, ESG departments in eligible corporations are freaked out. So it's any corporation that's listed, would have to report this, and they're saying, "Oh my God, how am I going to figure out, what the emissions of my buying steel is going to be?" And of course, if they talk to me, I'll be pretty reassuring, right? But not everybody is talked to. We're in a market where the demand largely exceeds the supply of carbon accounting. So most people have not talked to carbon accounting experts. And so they're thinking it's really difficult, which I would say there's an easy approach. And then, of course, if you want to have impact, it becomes a little more difficult because you have to collect more granular data, but it's doable. And you need, so to the point, so the SEC, I think, is coming no matter what, maybe even if it's delayed, for another 2 months or another year, something is coming for sure. And if it's not coming, there are other like imposed regulations that are happening already,
Mhm.
right? I was talking about Walmart, but you basically got 2,000 corporations in the US that have already made net zero pledges. They've signed up with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, so they don't need the SEC to move forward. But they're
Right.
already doing it, right? So it's happening. And even if you're a complete climate skeptic, it's going to happen, because if you want to work with these corporations, you may or may not believe that climate change is a real problem. You still have to do it in the same way that you have to report on HIPAA compliance if you're in healthcare, or SOC 2 if you're handling sensitive data and that kind of stuff.
Yep.
So I think that's just where it is. What's interesting about the regulation is not that it will impose new things on companies, is that it will clarify these questions that people are asking themselves. How granular do I need to be to report?
Right.
So I think the biggest obstacle to moving forward is, okay, but is this going to be enough? Will I be complying? I'm afraid of lawsuits. I don't want to be accused of misleading my shareholders because I'm not reporting emissions that are material.
Right.
And last but not least, so are we seeing traction on the market because of this? Definitely, because already right now, because the companies that are eyeing this are saying the regulation is going to come up late, and then it's going to tell me in 2024 that I need to report on my 2023 emissions. And I'm not prepared to do this, and so I need a rundown. I need a first try to see if I get it right the first time, so that
Right.
when it's really an obligation, I'll be ready and I'll have figured out what this means. And so we have a couple of customers who are in that mindset right now, and they're basically learning what their obligations is by working with us.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of? I'll give you a very simple example. Well, I've co-built multiple media companies with a former business partner who's one of my best friends. And by pure luck, we turned on Google Analytics the day we started our businesses every time. We didn't really need that data on day one, but a year later, we needed that old data. We needed to be collecting that information to have visibility in terms of how our business was operating. And I think it's very similar in a much more complicated way with this emissions conversation, in terms of collect the data now, get visibility on the data now, so that you have your ducks in a row the day of the regulations, or the day you want to comply with a certain mandate out there. So with that thought, go ahead. I'm sorry, you may have had a point.
No, just to react on this, I think we tend to think as politicians as their power being that of imposing stuff, right? But I think in this particular area, it's very much one of signaling as well, because this carbon footprint thing is not going to go away, right? The climate change is a problem that is likely to get worse in the coming years. So and of course, it's something where whatever you do now will have impact in 10 and 20 years, basically. So the earlier you start, the sooner you'll see the benefit, but there's still this hyperbolic effect, right? Yep. Of this delay between action and effect. But the point is, it's going to be reinforced. And I think markets are anticipating this. Think of it this way: why is it the SEC that's handling it and not the EPA?
Right.
Well, because if you're not appropriately anticipating in your financials the effect of climate change, you are actually probably misleading your shareholders. In the US, a lot of people have their retirement savings in a 401k.
Yes.
So basically, their retirement is linked to the economic performance of companies, right? So if people want to retire in 2050, and you've got a lot of these major corporations that have gone out of business so basically the value of their stocks have disappeared because they didn't properly anticipate it. So, climate change is not a distant problem. It's your retirement money, basically. And so that's what we mean by anticipating the effects of climate change on a company. And that's what the SEC is asking for. And another way of putting it is, let's say there's a price to carbon. So let's say your company emits 1 million tons a year. Now, maybe in the future, that ton of carbon, if we have to drastically reduce our emissions, maybe this ton of carbon could be worth $100. Not necessarily in taxes, but in cost of access to capital or in investments they need to make to reduce it. So you've basically got $100 million of cost for this company, right? And don't say I said taxes, because I think the cost, it's more costing actually. And so you have to put this into the valuation of a company now with a likeliness of this actually happening. So in the discounted cash flows. So that's why the SEC is handling it. And so that's why it's serious business too.
Yeah, absolutely serious business. So tell me a little bit more about the small business focus, because one of the reasons I was intrigued to speak with you was I do think too often this is a global 2000 company conversation. Not often enough is it a small business and mid-market conversation. So I'm curious, your engagement so far, is it mostly directly with small businesses, or do you have a partner program that's growing, and what type of partners do you want to be assisting these small businesses?
Yeah, a great question. So if you break down our customer base, about 40% are under 100 employees. Okay. About 30% are between basically 100 and 250 employees, and then maybe 20 above 250, and then maybe 10%. I didn't add up, but basically a minority of plus 1,000, right? Yeah. Maybe 20, 30 companies that are plus 1,000, out of 1,500. So point is, we have a lot of small businesses. Interestingly, most of these companies have zero obligation to do it by law. So they wouldn't be concerned by the SEC. They wouldn't even be concerned by the CSRD. But they are concerned by Walmart or the US Army, or in the UK, the NHS or whatever, asking for this. And so this is real stuff, because if you don't comply with the CSRD, you might get a 10,000 euro fine. But if you don't comply with the purchasing rules of Walmart, you might lose $1 million contract. Right. And so just the economic value of complying with carbon accounting is much stronger for these guys. So that's, I think, the prime reason. Second reason is you have a lot of companies whose core business it is to have a positive impact, or the founders, are super motivated. Starting a business today and not thinking about sustainability is kind of like, living in the wrong epoch or something, right? So a lot of the new businesses that you see today are people who say, look, I'm going to be doing diapers, but they're going to be much more climate friendly, or I'm going to be selling cookies or whatever. But they all have this sustainability focus in mind. And so these guys are trying to substantiate the claim that they make, that whatever they're doing is a more sustainable alternative. And they need an accountant to attest to that. And so it's this notion of, we talk about scope 1, 2, and 3, but there's also scope 4. So scope 4 is a lesser known concept. It's basically, what emissions am I avoiding versus the regular scenario. Oh, so, okay. If I'm building, concrete blocks, they emit a lot. But what if I found a process that's 10 times better in terms of emission? So I want to compute the emissions of my concrete blocks, and I want to subtract them from the average concrete block. And so I'm saving. I'm still emitting, but I'm also saving versus the standard, or the baseline, basically. Sure. So that's reason number two. I want to substantiate my claim. Reason number three, and we see that a lot in the tech sector, to be honest, is when you've got a lot of millennials as employees, they don't really want to be working with a company that doesn't care about the environment. I do understand that climate is politics in some countries, in some states, in some parties, but I wish nothing more than leaving it out of politics. And I think the whole ESG woke debate in the US is very interesting, but it's kind of difficult to understand for somebody who's not like in the US, to be honest, because environment is not politicized at all in places like Europe. So I don't have a solution, you know, for such a complex problem, but I would say if we could somehow detach the E from the S and the G and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, you know, that could look like a progress. Let's depoliticize climate, hopefully, because, you know, it's a real problem.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is. One follow-up question for you. Partners. So up in the enterprise, a chief sustainability officer may call on a big IT consulting firm to help with the sustainability strategy. In small business, do you see the small businesses calling on partners to assist with sustainability? And if so, what type of partners are you looking to attract to help the small businesses?
No, spot on. So we see this market segmentation whereby smaller companies generally don't want too much consulting, and larger companies, that's their culture, it's how they do business. Very often the buyer is a former consultant, you know, so the system perpetuates itself. But I would say under 200 or something employees, basically the promise that we offer is that you don't need a consulting company. I think you were comparing this to HIPAA or SOC 2 compliance. You know, you go to a platform, you do most of the stuff yourself, and then you've got the software company support or climate experts to help you. But what we see is, so we do most of it directly, right? I would say it's not a general rule because we do have partners that help us. So a lot of the ESG platforms, they request carbon footprint data, but they don't produce it themselves. So they push companies over to us. We see banks do it as well. In some part of Europe, you get a discount on your banking loans if you're on track for decarbonization. So you get an interest rate reduction. And so when you're asking the bank for a loan, you say, okay, well, I'll do it. Just tell me who to work with. And they'll send those guys over to us. We're going to see, I think, more of the chartered accountants coming to this business because they're helping you comply basically with regulations. So, well, here's a platform that can help you out, and we've been trained on it. So I think that could concern the mid-market. When we start to work with enterprise, and we have a couple, we work with their procurement department to help them engage their supply chain and their SMB customers. And here, what we tend to find is, just from a business perspective, the cycles are so long that we don't have the playbook for it, and they don't buy directly from guys like us. They're in the culture of buying from an implementation partner, and so we're partnering with these guys. I'm talking, Accenture, Capgemini, Cognizant, these kind of companies. But that takes a bit of time, and we're still a rather young company. But I think that's the way forward, basically, if I, lay my strategy bare for you here.
That sounds great. We have a couple minutes left. So tell me a little bit, we're having this conversation in mid-July 2023. What do you see as Greenly's key business priorities for the rest of 2023? And without pre-announcing any news or anything like that, are there some general priorities you have in mind for 2024?
Yeah, I mean, of course. So we've grown to nearly 10 million AR, annual recurring revenue, and to us, we're only at the beginning of our journey. So and you know, 1,000 or so companies looks like a lot, but climate change is such a big problem that really you have to address millions of companies. So this, if we are the chosen one, that's great. If we're not, whatever it is, it's going to be a huge, market. But we think we have a good chance because nobody has achieved our scale so far. And so what I think is, of course, this calls for hyperscaling growth. Basically, and we're making plans to have 100,000 companies as customer, and of course, customers want to be served and have good service and so on. So it means growing the company. It probably means fundraising, right? But apart from those financial aspects, from a product perspective, what we've learned working with so many of these companies is, you know, people don't want carbon accounting in general. They want an experience that's just right for their vertical or also for their size of business. So that's why I was talking tech companies, you know, they focus on their cloud. Investment funds, they have to focus on their investments. Manufacturers, they focus on whatever raw material and so on and so forth. So we're building a lot of custom calculators per sector. So we've announced last week, actually, the launch of the first climate app store in the world, which allows you to add on to the Greenly platform a custom or a vertical specific calculator that helps you take this deep dive into your business. So we kind of got this platform where it's like low floor entry. Get started, spend-based analytics, can get some stuff real fast, have first results, know where I'm going. But then, of course, now I know what scope 1, 2, and 3 is. I've become not exactly an expert, but actually pretty knowledgeable on the topic. And I want to take a deep dive. I activate those apps. And so the App Store that we launch is essentially a marketplace of stuff that we provide, but also that partners are providing. And it could be some person who's going to do a climate workshop in your company. It could be some person who's going to come over to your company and help you isolate your building or change your vehicle fleet from gasoline cars to electric. So implementation, not of the software, but of the actual, net zero action plans. So, and that's really exciting because we've been a first mover here. We have the scale. So I think we can really capture, or rather create, a lot of the value. And last but not least, supply chains, of course, are where the emissions are. And what is the factory of the world, if not China? So we have this feature where we reach out to suppliers and we capture the data, and now it's available for the whole world, including Chinese companies. So if you have to make some choice of who to work with, you want the best data on your supply chains, including in China. So I think that's definitely a direction we're going in.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward to hearing more. For partners who want to learn a little bit about the company, is there a particular URL or landing page they should head to?
So, go on our website, www.greenly.earth, like Mother Earth. And frankly, I answer emails, so you can also write directly to me, Alexis, Alexis, @greenly.earth.
Fantastic. I'll make sure we put your email address in the blog as well. Alexis, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Our readers and our viewers certainly appreciate it.
And thank you, Joe, so much for these great questions, and I had a lovely time talking to you today.